Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, March 26th, 2021, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about DC statehood and update you on where the Democratic Party is currently at pushing for DC statehood. Now, Washington, D.C. has never been a state in our union, and it has been in consideration for quite some time now. Following the 2020 election, in which the Democratic Party was able to win back control of the United States Senate, D.C. statehood has become a very real possibility. The House has already voted to make D.C. a state, but it ultimately comes down to a confirmation through the Senate. Right now, a 50-50 tie doesn't exactly entail an automatic victory for D.C. statehood, but it puts the possibility very, very close. Now, if we're looking at the DC statehood, you might be asking, why is this here? And pretty much they go through a number of things. Main things is that DC does not have any type of legislative representatives. They do have shadow senators and shadow representatives that can go into Congress but don't have any voting power and therefore no technical representation. And, this is something that it is kind of ironic that the country that fought against taxation without representation has its capital without representation. And while the Constitution does require a federal piece of land to hold up these government buildings, D.C. statehood has proposed a possibility where D.C. would pretty much just be cut around these areas. So let's go ahead and see if we can find this map that they are proposing. It's probably on the main website here because it is going to be pretty simple. I mean, essentially what they're doing is cutting out the National Mall and all of the major buildings. They're leaving, nearly 700,000 residents. I think actually a little bit above that, 700,000 residents on the outskirts of this newfound city with a newly drawn federal district. And, just looking at Washington, D.C. here, I don't know what the name would be. I'm assuming that it probably wouldn't be the state of Columbia. We're not entirely sure yet, but as of right now, it looks as if, it will no longer be the District of Columbia, but rather, of course, a state. So pretty much you can go to the website at statehood.dc.gov. This has been pushed for a very long time, only recently gaining a lot of traction. And we're going to talk about how the Democratic Party is in a very good point for DC statehood and what it would actually do if passing the United States Senate. So as of right now, what do we see? 47 Democrats are in current support of it, and 50 Republicans, of course, are opposed to it. There are 3 unsure Democrats, and, the Washingtonian actually released an article talking about the Democrats who haven't co-sponsored the bill. Now, you can very much be in support of a bill and not co-sponsor it. When you're looking at the support in the United States Senate, there are 41 Democrats who co-sponsor it, and then an independent, which is Bernie Sanders in the state of Vermont. So 42 co-sponsors for this bill. And what you're seeing is that there are a lot of co-sponsors across the country. We're talking about senators from Montana, the Democrat Jon Tester there, and then in Colorado and in New Mexico. And if you look here, down in Georgia, actually, which I find to be very interesting, despite this race being competitive here, what you'll see is that Raphael Warnock is a co-sponsor of this bill. So we have 42 Democrats that are up for this bill that are saying, absolutely, with 8 who have yet to respond. But the thing is, those who aren't exactly immediate co-sponsors of this bill as of right now, we've seen previous endorsements for DC statehood. So the senators that are currently holding out are, Joe Manchin, Mark Kelly, Kyrsten Sinema, and actually Angus King in the state of Maine. I'm not going to assume that one is safe either. But you see here, looking at this list, Angus King doesn't really make sense. But Kyrsten Sinema, slightly. She comes from a competitive state, but so do other Democrats, so it's not necessarily an excuse. Joe Manchin comes from a state that's one of the most Republican states in the country. So you could argue, he does come from a state that is very Republican. He wouldn't exactly want to make his constituents too angry, but at the same time, he isn't going to win re-election in 2024 in almost all certainty. So politically speaking, while he might be trying to run for re-election in 2024, it just simply isn't going to work on the presidential ballot. Jon Tester has been a co-sponsor on previous statehood legislation, so he may not currently be one. Actually, the DC website says he is. This is a little outdated. This was back February 2nd, so things have changed since then. But, just bringing it up, Jon Tester seems to be on board. Jeanne Shaheen seems to be on board with her previous statements. Jon Ossoff, Raphael Warnock have been supportive of DC statehood. When you watch that 60 Seconds interview, he said that he supported DC statehood, Jon Ossoff being him. Raphael Warnock seems to be on board as well. John Hickenlooper, absolutely on board. Mark Kelly hasn't exactly said whether or not he supports or doesn't support it. He might lean towards support it. He's taken a lot more liberal positions than Kyrsten Sinema, so he might be the one that moves over in Arizona, but still needs 50 votes at this point. And then Ben Ray Lujan, who currently isn't a co-sponsor, but was a co-sponsor as a representative. So the only 4 that we're really unsure about are Mark Kelly, Kyrsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, and Angus King. And, at this point, this brings the Democrats to 46. Realistically speaking, probably 47 with Mark Kelly in the state of Arizona. It's possible that Angus King does cross over as well. He doesn't exactly represent a Republican state or even a swing state. He has won by very large margins in the past in 2018 and 2012. Just looking at the state of Maine itself, there is no real reason as to why it should be considered a swing state or even a state that is going to be angry at the prospect of DC statehood. But this would put the Democratic Party, at a very close position here with just the 47 votes that seem to be following through. 46 is the closest the Democratic Party has ever been to DC statehood. 47 seems to be, the maximum at this point. But if we do see the Democratic Party pass it, this will be monumental for many reasons. First of all, we will see an additional 2 new Senate seats added to the United States Senate, an additional House seat added to the United States Senate, bringing the House to 436 seats rather than 435. By the next census, it'll return back to being 435, but the Senate will not return back to being 100. It will remain at 102. And we can actually see what this would do. So I'm going to go ahead and take my home state of Maryland and add 1 delegate to the special and then 1 delegate to the general. And then what we're going to do is change the colors back to Democrat colors here. And we're just going to see that, what this would look like if the Democratic Party did actually pass the DC statehood and what that would mean for the overall electorate. Well, this blue actually is a little bit more darker and a little bit more annoying, I would say, than the other blue. It's kind of hard on the eyes. Let's go ahead and adjust this main color just so it's a little bit easier for you to see. But that didn't make it much better either. I'm not good with colors. Let's hope this one. Let's hope for the best. Okay. It's okay. I don't really like it, but it's fine. DC, if becoming a state, would bring the Democrats to 52. It's kind of making me a little upset here. Bring the, I can't get it right. I simply cannot get it right. What is going on? Whatever. Let's just keep it for right now. But what this would do essentially is bring the Democrats to not a 2-seat majority, but a 1-seat majority, which means they would be +1 and would have room to lose 1 seat in 2022. So let's say, for instance, with DC statehood passing, the Republicans are able to pick up Georgia. Well, the Democrats still have the majority. Let's say the Republicans pick up Arizona. Well, the Democrats are only down 1. You see, with the 50-50 tie that we're at currently, the Republicans just need 1 seat. With DC statehood, the Republicans would need 2 seats. On top of that, this would prevent Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema from being super big leverage points individually. Let's say Kyrsten Sinema's on board, but Joe Manchin is not, as we've actually seen recently. So let's say, that's the case, right? Joe Manchin says, you know what, I'm not voting party line. But what happens? Rather than the bill not passing and the Democratic Party being forced to listen to Joe Manchin, to whatever he wants, to have him with all the leverage, the Democrats will be able to pass it through Vice President Kamala Harris. Let's say the roles are reversed. Joe Manchin supports it, but Kyrsten Sinema does not. Same exact deal. You see, these senators that have been holding up key pieces of legislation, and eventually one of them comes around, trying to force the other to come around, all they would need is one of those senators to jump on board, and it'd be done. All they would need to do is compromise with one of them, not both, which means they wouldn't need to make revisions. They'd get 48 votes, right? Then 2 of them are holding out. One of them says, I want this added in. The other says, I want this added in. Well, if the Democratic Party wants things to get done currently, they need to listen to both. Well, now they'll only have to listen to one. But DC statehood is largely being opposed by these senators, possibly because they know they will lose leverage if it passes. If you're looking at the DC statehood co-sponsors, none of these senators have tried to hold as much leverage as Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema. Kyrsten Sinema has actually voted with Trump and the Republican Party more than she has voted with the Democratic Party during her tenure as senator. Same thing with Joe Manchin. It's around 50-50 even time, but the next Democrat to run up there isn't even John Tester, but even at that point, it's around 33%. So just looking at our map here, I made a video talking about this before, how Joe Manchin would lose all leverage and all power if he ended up passing DC statehood. But the thing is, even though he wants that leverage, the Democratic Party needs this DC statehood to pass if they want to have better chances at retaining the majority in the future. But it's not just that, because DC may be a very partisan eventual state, but I don't think that should disqualify it from becoming a state. As someone who lives on the outskirts, outside of Washington, D.C., I live in Prince George's County, Maryland. I can show you exactly where that is relative to D.C. It's a 20-minute drive for me to get to the metro and a 10-minute drive or 10-minute metro ride from there to Washington, D.C. I go to D.C. for fun. I go to the National Mall for fun, right? And when I'm talking to people that actually live inside Washington, D.C., that are, regulars, as people would put it, not tourists, right? What they essentially know and are told all the time is that a lot of their concerns are not heard of. And, we see these arguments from the Republican Party that because of yard signs and because of protests, that D.C. already gets the representation that it needs. But until they get a voting body where they will actually have some type of leverage on the Senate level, where they will be able to vote on the pieces they introduce, because they can still, bring things to the floor, but they can't vote on it. And that's the really interesting part about it. And, this is my county right here. This is Washington, D.C. Interestingly enough, my county voted very similarly to Washington, D.C. But if you look at my county, right, 400,000 votes across the entire state. How many votes in Wyoming? How many votes in Montana, right? How many votes in North Dakota, in South Dakota? The numbers are comparable or sometimes more. Looking at my county, we have representation. It doesn't matter that we're extremely partisan in one way. We still have representation. When you look at Wyoming, it's the most Republican state in the union. It's a very partisan state. It still has representation. And it's not the argument that can be made for every city. People bring up this point, if DC is a city and ends up having representation, doesn't that mean other cities should? They do. They do. Chicago does, right? Philadelphia does. They do. They have their own congressional districts. They have their own state legislatures. They have their own ability to govern themselves and then also impact the national outcome. What does DC have? 3 electoral votes, and that's it. Nothing else. And I don't think that it really matters that this is a partisan state, because at the end of the day, I am for statehood for every single part of the United States. That means Puerto Rico included. Of course, that includes Washington, D.C. Statehood should not be limited to states that are deemed to be as acceptable for the Republicans and the Democrats. Potential states should not be determined on whether or not they actually become states based on their partisan composition. And while, yes, it will benefit the Democratic Party, that doesn't mean they don't deserve representation. That's the thing. Just because it helps the Democrats doesn't mean they don't deserve representation, because they pay the most taxes. They are here in the nation's capital, in the country that was founded on no taxation without representation. It's on the license plates, and it doesn't have DC statehood. That's the really big thing here, that it seems hypocritical for this country to not include Washington, D.C. as a state. And, looking at the statehood reasons, I don't exactly see why we are seeing opposition to it, except for these Democrats who realize they will no longer have leverage, and the Republicans who realize that it won't be favorable to them. But that shouldn't be a disqualifying factor. Your own reasons that you want leverage should not be a disqualifying factor for certain states. You are disenfranchising 700,000 residents. D.C. has more people than Wyoming, than Vermont. So population-wise, why are these states states? So overall, looking at the outcome of D.C. statehood, the Democratic Party is at the closest point they've been. We've seen no Republicans jump on board to D.C. statehood. And I'm sure that they are being told constantly by Mitch McConnell and other members of the Republican Party that they cannot vote for it. They simply cannot. Even if the Democrats are able to pass it, they can't vote for it because it looks bad. Because it would bring in 2 new Democratic seats. They would be immediately labeled as rhinos. They would be primaried within the next election. So D.C. statehood, is popular amongst the American people. The majority of Americans support it. The majority of D.C. residents support it. The majority of senators might not support it, but the Democratic Party is the closest they've ever been to passing D.C. statehood right now, with 47 votes, with a total of 42 co-sponsors across the United States. This is getting much, much closer. Right now, what the Democratic Party needs to do in order to win this region is to, get Angus King on board, get Joe Manchin on board, get Kristen Sinema and Mark Kelly on board, and they're set. But the problem is still that, these are Democrats that come from previously Republican states, or not for the case of Angus King, but also, very Republican states for the case of Joe Manchin, and they might be afraid that if they do end up backing DC statehood, that it will harm their reelection chances. But ultimately, it will benefit the Democratic Party in the long run. And just, speaking about it without any type of partisan nature, it will also benefit the residents in this newfound state because it will give them electoral representation in Congress rather than just on the presidential level. So that's my little update on DC statehood. We will see more and more come out as more senators start to support it or withdraw their support. We have a little bit ways to go until we do see a new Senate get inaugurated. It might get through, it might not. It ultimately comes down to those 4 senators that I mentioned and whether or not the Democrats can whip enough votes to get it passed. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2022 midterm election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.